I'm going to introduce Ida Yalzadeh, who is a visiting assistant professor in Asian American Studies at Northwestern. She received her PhD in American Studies from Brown University after completing a dissertation completion fellowship at the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. We're really lucky to have her. Professor Yalzadeh researches and teaches across units, geographies, state entities, bringing kind of humanistic analysis and kind of empirical analysis together to objects that often escape such a gaze. That's true even of the academy itself. For those of you who don't know, Professor Yalzadeh is also the creator of a zine called Navigating Grad School as a Woman of Color, and I highly recommend it. So her talk today emerges from her current book project, which is itself entitled Solidarities and Solitude, Tracing the Racial Boundaries of the Iranian Diaspora. And her talk today is called Support the 41, Iranian Student Activism in Northern California, 1970 to 1971. So please help me welcome Ida Yalzadeh. Thank you, Ida.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all so much for attending my talk. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have for the next hour. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right. And can folks see the screen okay? Okay, great. So first, I'd like to thank Northwestern's Middle East North African Studies program for organizing this event, along with Asian American Studies and the Center for Historical Studies for co-sponsoring it. I'd also like to thank Rebecca Johnson, Danny Postel, and Cindy Pingree for organizing this and inviting me to speak. So as Rebecca said, the talk I'm giving today is taken from a chapter I wrote recently for an edited volume called American-Iranian Dialogues that has to do with the same subject matter as what I wrote my dissertation on, and I look forward to our conversations that will follow. On June 26, 1970, 41 unarmed Iranian protesters entered the Iranian Consulate at 3400 Washington Street in San Francisco, California. Once some secured the building and held employees in their offices, others took down and slashed through pictures of the Shah of Iran hung on the consulate walls. In their place, the protesters painted slogans in English and Farsi denouncing the leader. A select few then went into the office of Vice Consul Mortaza Ali Akbar, and they began calling reporters, telling them to come to the consulate for a press conference. It was only after police walking by the building saw the banner hanging outside, the one that said, "Down with the Shah, puppet of US imperialism," that the tactical squad of the San Francisco Police Department was called to the scene. Upon entering, the police began restraining the protesters, who fought back by throwing office supplies and furniture. Despite the violent altercations that ensued, the tactical squad regained control of the consulate and arrested the instigators. Television stations captured the scene that took place outside of the consulate, as police officers escorted these Iranians, men and women, out into the back of a police truck. The TAC squad, wearing helmets and leather gloves with nightsticks in their hand and guns in their holster, dragged out the 41 as they yelled in protest. This was the first mass arrest of Iranians in the United States, and all 41 Iranians were held with a bail of between $2,000 and $4,000. 1 month later, a trial was held to prosecute the 41, where each was sentenced to 35 days in jail, 3 years of probation, and a fine. The Iranians who took over the consulate, most of whom came from middle and upper class families in Iran, acted under the leadership of the Northern California branch of the Iranian Students Association, or the ISA. The organization was housed under the international group of Iranian oppositionist students called the Confederation of Iranian Students National Union, or the CISNU, whose activities and international reach were integral to the 1979 revolution. However, in the early 1970s, the ISA was working toward two goals. First, to bring awareness to the atrocities being committed under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and second, to bring together the working masses of the Third World. With these two goals in mind, the 41 hoped the occupation would lead to a press conference where Iranian policymakers would publicly hear their grievances. The oppositionist activity in the United States was particularly vital, considering the country's importance in modernizing Iran during the pre-revolutionary era. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the United States was at the helm of modernization efforts in Iran, as the Shah's elite-driven white revolution attempted to show the global community of the West that Iran was on par with the developed nations of the Cold War era. As a result, Iranians came to the United States by the thousands as temporary student sojourners, studying at universities throughout the country. After their Western education, they were expected to go back to Iran and develop the nation in the US image. And as a result of this relationship, both countries worked to minimize the visibility of any Iranian opposition. When taken alongside the Third World and anti-war movements in the United States, though, Iranian political dissent was part of larger internationalist movements. The Iranian Consulate's occupation, after all, took place around 2 months after the Kent State shootings at the height of the anti-war movement. Student-led oppositionist protests were par for the course during the late 60s and early 70s, as organizations worked together within university spaces to bring about change, whether in response to Vietnam War or US neocolonialism in Iran. There was a large number of Iranian students, both within the homeland and abroad, that were involved in agitating against the imperial government of Iran, and the 1970 consulate takeover became an important part of that struggle. As a CISNU booklet put it at the time, quote, "The case of the 41 was perhaps the single most successful endeavor by Iranian students in the US to bring the issue of political repression in Iran to the attention of the American public," end quote. Despite their numbers, oppositionist students were dismissed by Iranian and US policymakers as a small, outspoken minority that did not represent Iranian opinions on the Shah's rule and US foreign policy. Instead, the US government overlooked these discretions to position Iranian migrants broadly as international model minorities, particularly when compared to other communities of color living in the United States who were born within its borders. The allegedly tolerable treatment of Iranians in the United States was framed as an example of American benevolence in the Cold War era. Iranians like the 41 who had occupied the consulate were then read as exceptions to the larger number of students who, it was assumed, would contribute to the prosperity of Iran and also the United States. Rather than focus on the impact of the 1970 occupation, and the occupation's impact on Iran, this talk will explore how this occupation and its aftermath can serve as a microcosm for understanding the shifting relationship between US-Iran foreign policy and Iranian racialization in the US. In this era, countries like Iran were meant to be cooperative and grateful client states. But Iranian students under the ISA instead positioned themselves as part of US protest culture, third worldism, and the larger legacy of the global 1968 movements. It is through this lens that I really see the significance of the 41 emerging. So the dynamics present in the 1970 consulate takeover and its aftermath are integral to two dynamics that I suggest are central to Iranian racial formation in the United States. First, these events highlight the nascent disciplinary powers in the United States that would come to racialize Iranians during the US embassy takeover in Tehran 8 years later. And second, the 41 show how Iranian political oppositionists themselves strategized visibility and solidarity while agitating for political change. While the neo-colonial relationship between the United States and Iran placed Iranians as international model minorities, my talk will hopefully show how Iranian students were able to puncture the tapestry of an amicable neo-colonial relationship nonetheless. So first, I'd like to touch on the ways in which the occupation's aftermath illustrated a nascent racialization of Iranians that would come into full force during the revolution and hostage crisis. So the mass arrest of the 41 signaled a need for US state powers to determine a course of action. And in this case, it was threatened deportation in order to deal with a group of migrants who were political oppositionists to one of their most important allies. And critical to this process was the relationship between arms of the US state, the media, and US immigration policy. So if we go back to the police and the tactical squad being at the consulate, as police haul these students out of the consulate, news reporters were vying to get a soundbite from supervising police captain Jeremiah Taylor just outside. And as he broke down the charges against the dissenters, Taylor mentioned the other institution that would take interest in the incident. Quote, "We'll en route them to the immigration department on the assumption that most of them are foreign born and will be interested in by the immigration department," end quote. By mentioning the Immigration and Naturalization Service, Taylor implied the potential deportation of some, if not all, of the arrested based on their actions in the consulate. Though he tried to couch this threat in overly bureaucratic jargon, the threat of deportation loomed all too clearly for most of the members who participated in the occupation, as only 4 were permanent residents of the United States. The Iranian students themselves were quick to pick up on this issue, as many of their public appeals took note of the role that the Immigration and Naturalization Service had in disciplinary action after the occupation of the consulate. Days after the incident, the Iranian Students Association published a letter in the Daily Californian, the school paper at UC Berkeley. Before listing their demands to Iranian and American governments, they mentioned the consequences of the Iranian consulate occupation, stating that members of the ISA were still in custody at a San Francisco jail, while also, quote, "being harassed by the immigration office. Immigration office has threatened to deport them," end quote, even though they all had valid visas. As the Iranian Students Association saw it, the INS made every effort to deport them. Once in Iran, they would then face a jail term of 3 to 10 years for their political oppositionist activities. The assertion of the INS's role also spread internally throughout the branches of the ISA and then internationally through the CISNU. Internal organization documents from the Northern California branch summarized the aftermath of the occupation and noted that the 41 were under investigation by authorities for their visa status and other immigration matters. In letters to the CISNU Board of Directors in West Germany, the ISA Secretary of Defense Activity and Publicity Secretary wrote that the INS was working with the Iranian consul and the US police to put pressure on the arrested members. The use of INS for the purposes of biopolitical management of the US state is nothing new. This kind of threatened deportation was and continues to be prevalent, particularly for Latinx and Asian diasporic populations in the United States. So while the events I'm talking about can definitely be read as a precedent to immigration procedure for Middle Eastern Americans after September 11th, for instance, I'm hoping here to also emphasize the way in which the occupation's aftermath articulate racial scripts previously used in other communities of color in the United States. And here I'm using Natalia Molina's concept of racial scripts to signify the ways in which racialized groups are linked across time and space through common discriminatory practices by institutions and citizens. And specifically, I'm connecting what I found in the archive to similar work done on the history of Asian American surveillance and exclusion that has been done by scholars such as Mei Nai and Ellen Wu, which I'd love to talk about further in the Q&A. Understanding Police Captain Taylor's initial remarks then on immigration, when we look at it through this lens, indicates a nascent racial formation that's based within a politicized immigration procedure that has been used time and time again. Mainstream media additionally served as an unofficial arm of US state power, as it worked to discredit ISA concerns. Similar to previous instances of political dissent from Iranian students in the early 1960s, the US media used language that masked the grievances of the Iranian Students Association. So for instance, the San Francisco Chronicle's coverage of the situation prioritized the perspective of Iranian Consul Adil. He characterized the actions and demands of the ISA as methods by which the organization hoped to undermine the democracies of the United States and Iran. Given that this was during the Cold War era, where the US was practicing a policy of containment, Adil was implying that these students were communists who were a threat to democracy and stability in Iran. The media characterized Iranian dissidents as trying to topple Iran's progress toward becoming a developed nation. So the implications of Adil's accusations then not only villainized the ISA's actions, but it also discredited the concerns of the student community. However, I'd also like to note that these Iranian students and members of the ISA were not without their privileges in the pre-revolutionary era. This privilege came with their country's relationship to the United States, as well as their own class status. In terms of Iran's relationship to the US, as I stated before, they were seen as ideal subjects of a client state. So by this hand then, these Iranian students retained some privileges during the occupation that may not have been so easy for other marginalized communities at the time. So for instance, the occupation of the consulate itself did not get widespread coverage nationally. It remained a local news story that seemed not to get beyond the San Francisco Chronicle. It's likely that this remained local news because the United States was in the midst of the Vietnam War, and the issue of Iranian political opposition was still on the back burner, despite its growing visibility throughout the country. Moreover, by treating this as a local issue that did not gain great national attention, Iranian students were able to go on with their daily lives without facing the discrimination that would come later with the occupation of the US Embassy in Tehran from 1979 to 1981. The lack of national mobilization against these students, either on the part of the United States or Iran, allowed them to continue their oppositionist work in the public sphere without much uproar from the American public. Furthermore, these students were mostly from a high socioeconomic class. A good amount of my source material for this talk actually comes from the personal papers of Parviz Shokat, who here is seen photographed when he first arrived to the US. And he was one of the 41 who participated in and was arrested during the 1970 occupation. So while Shokat first came to the US for secondary school, he became heavily involved in ISA activities as a college student at UC Berkeley. But of note here is the fact that his family knew the Shah, and that prior to leaving Iran, Shokat actually had a conversation with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi about what he would be studying in the United States. So perhaps it's through these sorts of backgrounds and connections that members of the ISA were able to deftly navigate the US legal system while still advocating against the Pahlavi regime. In the time leading up to and after the trial of the 41, Shokat's charges were reduced with the help of legal counsel, and he ultimately spent 35 days in prison with 3 years of probation, just like the others. And although the 41 were still convicted, members like Shokat did not face immediate immigration consequences from the incident. None of them were deported despite official threats. Even if we look at Shokat's case 2 years later, his probation officer worked to get both his probation terminated early and the guilty verdict expunged from his record. In an appeal to the higher courts, the officer uses discourses of the model minority as a means of legitimizing her request. She describes him as, quote, a mature person, not the type of person who would engage in the activities as described in the police report, a person of superior intelligence, highly motivated to obtain a good education and accept his family responsibilities, end quote. She also made note of his permanent resident status and his status as a father, husband, and provider, not to mention that he claimed to be done with the nefarious activities of his past. Quote, The defendant states that he is no longer actively involved with the Iranian Association and that he is not in school. He plans of starting his own business in the field in which he is employed, end quote, which was printing. But ironically enough, Shokat did begin his own business in printing, and he, alongside his normal jobs, worked to print radical Iranian oppositionist documents to be taken back to and distributed in Iran. So despite their international model minority status, the US state dealt with the occupation through systems that had already been in place for minoritized subjects in the United States. Specifically, the relationship between the US judicial system and the politics of migration exemplify the racial scripts that were used to marginalize other communities of color in the United States in the past, particularly Asian Americans. So you can see how this is a very sort of messy way of working through racial formation, and it's something that I'd look forward to talking about as well after this talk. So now that I've spent some time talking about the ways in which the state used US racial scripts to threaten deportation and delegitimize the grievances of Iranian students, I'd like to turn to how the ISA reacted to and navigated through these systems of early minoritization. And specifically, I want to touch on the way in which the Northern California branch of the ISA forged connection with other leftist student communities as a means of building cross-coalitional solidarities and gaining more backing from their political objectives. In fact, the ISA relied on these connections to get the word out about the occupation and arrest of the 41, as well as to create solidarity around revolutionary anti-imperialism. So while student activism was nothing new to the history of Iranians abroad, its form in the United States resulted in coalition building with other communities under a third worldist rhetoric that was also attuned to the mechanics of US racialization. And through these interactions with other student groups in the US, the Northern California branch reflected the strategies that the ISA would nationally continue to deploy in the 1970s. And California was a particularly critical location to the construction of the Iranian diaspora, both before and after the revolution. And although the most well-known location of the Iranian diaspora is Los Angeles or Tehrangeles, because it has the largest number of Iranians in the world outside of Iran itself, I suggest that the Bay Area was also a critical hub because of what it did for activist circles. The Northern California branch in particular enabled the ISA to connect with other major student organizing communities, also fighting against US imperialism and colonialism through their shared urban space. The members of the ISA themselves were conscious of what these connections would allow them to accomplish on behalf of their home country. A June 30th CBS report broadcasted on the local news showed folks picketing in reaction to the arrest of the 41. When a reporter asked an ISA spokesman whether they feared being deported, the latter responded, quote, "I think we are basically relying on the people in this country to show the collaboration between the consulate here and the US Immigration Office, and how they put political pressure on us when we want to represent our just views and demands in this country," end quote. Behind him, Iranians and Americans demonstrated and held signs that read, "Support the just struggle of the 41 students," which you can see in the picture that I have throughout this presentation. In another venue, a letter from the ISA in the Daily Californian appealed to progressive forces to join their fight to release the 41 members. The ISA regarded these local connections to other leftist organizations as vital to their effort in having these students released from jail. And the occupation and arrests made at the consulate triggered a wave of demonstrations and unrest among other leftist student groups. So within their own organization, the ISA branches in Chicago and New York had their own demonstrations in solidarity with the 41. But in the Bay Area itself, Iranian students and other organizations, such as the Arab Student Association, the Progressive Labor Party, Students for a Democratic Society, the Asian Student Organization, and the Black Students Union, demonstrated outside of the consulate, constantly voicing their anti-imperialist slogans and distributing leaflets to onlookers about releasing the 41. The buy-in from other student groups was critical to getting the word out to other communities, as well as creating a space for liberatory agendas. That being said, the Iranian Students Association saw its local ties to leftist organizations as also serving causes larger than the specificity of this incident. In many of their English language flyers, the ISA remarked on points of convergence between Iranians and other communities of color in the US and abroad. For example, an ISA handout on the arrests and trials of the 41 attempted to forge solidarity with, quote, our American fellow captives of imperialism, the Black and Third World people, end quote. Given the rise of Third Worldism, the anti-war movement, and civil rights in the United States during the decades prior, I suggest that this point of coalition building was intentionally based within the longer histories of racial formation in the United States. By situating their own struggles within frameworks of judicial discrimination, criminalization, and colonialism, the ISA consciously sought out local connections as they became increasingly embedded within radical networks in the United States. Aside from their publications, the ISA hosted events meant to bring organizations together under common values and objectives. In early July of 1970, the Northern California branch organized a screening at UC Berkeley for East is Red, a film that discusses the Chinese Revolution through a context that suits many anti-imperial struggles. The students characterized it as, quote, a true representation of the potential of the people's culture, achieved through an uncompromising political and cultural revolution of the Chinese people, end quote. And I'd just like to read the bottom as well, which talks about defending the 41. Quote, by coming to this picture, which is an exemplary manifestation of a revolutionary people, let's show our support for the struggle of the 41, end quote. Another leaflet advertised a July 22nd screening of a film on the Russian Revolution with the same rhetoric written at the bottom of the publicity flyer. In ISA reports to their international network, the East is Red screening was said to have been attended by 700 people and soon became a demonstration site. So by showcasing to the rest of the organization that these events were well attended and sparked agitation, the Northern California branch emphasized the importance of understanding their political goals through a broader framework of common struggle. And these leftist groups, not only did they demonstrate alongside the ISA, but they also materially supported the Iranian students' causes. The bail that the 41 had to pay was covered through donations to the organization, earmarked specifically for their support. According to different ISA documents, about $18,000 was collected by the mass support of progressive and democratic individuals, not only in Northern California, but from various cities throughout the US as well. So this monetary investment was integral for these individuals to get out on bail and also to pay for their subsequent legal expenses. These local ties were then highlighted in internal correspondence. So members of the ISA would then write to the CISNU after public gatherings and protests in support of the 41 to highlight the amount of support they received from the other members of the community. They reported, for instance, that during the July 1st demonstration, a member of the Progressive Workers' Party and a member of an Asian students organization gave speeches in support of the 41 in front of the immigration office. The march itself also consisted of members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the Organization of Arab Students, and the Black Student Union. Furthermore, they commented that the demonstration had a, quote, impressive, unquote, number of Black students sharing their support for the release of the 41. So these remarks underscore the importance of local buy-in by other radical organizations in order to bolster their legitimacy in the United States. And moreover, it spoke to a sense of solidarity present between the people of the Third World and those oppressed within the United States. Ultimately, this solidarity between radical student organizations proved to be one of the facets that allowed the ISA to gain a solid holding in Northern California and its activist milieu, as well as continue to agitate for change in their home country. So to conclude, the 1970 mass arrest of the 41 is illustrative of two emerging dynamics that came to define the lived experience of Iranian students in the 1970s. So I suggest that while the United States broadly positioned Iranian foreign students as model minorities who form part of the client state, Iranian political opposition was nonetheless present as a force that had to be reckoned with. As a result, US state powers delegitimized ISA grievances through the deportation tactics and media bias, showing how racial scripts previously used to marginalize other communities of color were applied to Iranian dissenters. And then in turn, Iranian student oppositionists strategized through solidarity movements tied to the Third World and anti-war movement in the Bay Area. So I want to end this talk with a brief note on how I see these Iranian foreign nationals fitting into narratives of US racial formation. And I'm primarily doing this here by thinking through Chi-Ming Wang's work on the Asian American foreign student, which is a term that for him captures the transnational flows and struggles of national belonging through an imperial relationship. This talk similarly seeks to place Iranian student sojourners in a larger conversation that recognizes the importance of Asia, and in this case, West Asia, as a political and social site of significance to the formation of racialization in the US nation state more broadly. Indeed, the makeup of Iranian migrants in the US during the pre-revolutionary period follows along the lines of other Asian American groups through a shared geopolitical and imperial project brought on by the US. So by engaging with the model minority figure and its permutations, I'm hoping that this prompts future conversations on domestic racialization to move beyond national borders and think through how imperial projects produce these minoritized subjects. Thank you all so much.
Hello all, great, sorry, there's a hosting dilemma. Thank you so much, Ida, for that. That was really a really rich and provocative talk. And I'm gonna open this up for chat and for hand raising. And so I'm just going to keep it, there we go. Wonderful, great. And I'll let you guys collect your thoughts for a second. Okay. Well, we have one hand raised. Make sure I got this, everyone. Great. Kam biziftihar. You need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I see the imperial dimension of her talk. I don't quite see the racial. I mean, imperially, yes. The US typically doesn't like people who go against the grain. In those days during the Shah, he was a strong ally of the US and they wanted to keep it that way. They were not going to be bothered by a handful of students, nor are they today where they're just the opposite. They hate the current regime. They don't care about the 2 million Americans who'd like to see regime change in Iran. They basically are going to follow what's in US interest in the military industrial complex. But I don't see the racial side of it. I mean, when you look at that kid Parviz, he looks whiter than any American kid out there. So please explain how the two are intertwined.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that question. And, you know, my larger project speaks to the racial dynamics that, you know, I see sort of moving throughout the time after the coup to the present sort of prior to, so up until the Obama era, because I don't want to touch the current situation that's happening right now. But in terms of racialization, in my larger project, I'm really thinking about the ways in which rhetorics of Aryanness and the Aryan state get transferred to the diaspora, and how factions happen through rhetorics of Aryanness and its connection to the Pahlavi dynasty. So in my larger work, I show how there are particular groups, especially after the revolution, that are royalists who identify with being a part of the Aryan state. And so they're sort of claiming proximities to whiteness through the documents that I look through, and the ways in which I see them like performing a sense of whiteness and proximity to whiteness through their high socioeconomic class. However, I also see a different faction arising, which is the student oppositionist. And to me, the way in which they are managed by the state. So for example, the immigration procedures that are used against them, particularly during the revolution, and then the way in which the media covers them, speak to ways in which other communities of color in the United States have been minoritized and racialized and criminalized in the United States. So while I see that definitely happening in the revolutionary period, I see you know, there's, for example, a protest that occurs that I talk about called the Battle of Beverly Hills in 1979. And this protest sees, it turns violent in Los Angeles. There are police cars that start ramming into protesters, hurling their bodies, right? And so the instances, and this is just one instance of many instances of police brutality during this time, right? And these tactics, you know, have been used in order to manage other minoritized populations in the United States. So I use the concept of racial scripts in order to sort of connect them and show how similar processes are being used to render Iranians non-white. And so with this talk in particular, because it's occurring in the earlier 1970s, I'm arguing that although racialization isn't as sort of emphasized and isn't as visible as it might be during the revolution and hostage crisis, the ways in which the US state is working to sort of manage these student oppositionists speak to a sort of like nascent formation of the process that then gets like more and more visible, you know, in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. Great. Great. I'll unmute you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, this is a COVID-19 question. Something happened in the house and I missed part of it, and especially I missed the beginning. So maybe you've provided that information already, I just maybe missed it. I was just wondering, you know, was there a major change of approach among the Iranian students who moved to the United States late 1960s, early 1970s, in the sense that when the opposition movement really gained momentum, let's say 1970, for example, were the people involved in it, do you have any sense that the people who were involved in it had given up on the idea of returning to Iran at one point, or were really thinking about, you know, remaining in the United States afterwards? Because of course there's so much risk involved in opposing the Iranian government at the time. So I'm just curious about, you know, tactically, what they had in mind. Were they under the impression that because they were in the United States, even without necessarily a permanent resident status, that they were safe from any kind of prosecution, or are they fully conscious of the risks involved? And were they thinking of going back, or had they given up on that idea? Do you have any sense from the sources?
So in terms of, you know, how, whether or not they were fully conscious of the consequences, I would say yes, definitely. So in the 1960s, for example, there is this case of this, and Michael Shannon talks about this in his book, Losing Hearts and Minds, where there is one student, I believe his last name is Yalzadeh, and he was a oppositionist in an Iranian student group, and Iran denied renewing his visa. And at that time, it was actually the US that were in support of his critiques of the Iranian state, and got him to remain in the United States. So it's interesting because I think that these students are fully aware of the fact that they can be deported, and that's what they say throughout the documents, right? They talk about, you know, primarily in the English language documents, because they're trying to reach, you know, these other leftist student groups who might not necessarily understand their situation. They're trying to say, hey, listen, if something happens to us and we are deported, we will face jail time in Iran. So I think that they were very much aware of that situation. I do think, though, that ultimately, given the sort of what they were agitating for, a lot of them did eventually want to go back in order to fight, or in order to, you know, be a part of the revolution, right? And that's actually what happened with a lot of them. You know, once the revolution started up, a lot of these students went back to Iran and, you know, ended up dying during the revolution. So, yeah, it's a interesting sort of understanding, because, you know, on the one hand, they're trying to remain in the United States to sort of, you know, conduct political change and make sure that these networks are being upheld, but at the same time, they also need to go back in order to, you know, agitate for change there and be a part of the regime, you know, changing eventually.
Thank you. I've got a question from Jessica Winiger. I'm going to unmute her.
Thank you so much, Ida. This was truly, truly a terrific talk, and I'm really excited to hear about, hear even more about the connections between the student group and other student groups in the time, particularly in the Bay Area, which continues to be a place of international solidarity movements, particularly among, you know, Iranians and Arabs. And my question is about whether or not Israel was playing any role in the student activism at the time, particularly perhaps in the solidarity between the Arab student activists and the Iranian student activists. Perhaps it's a little early, but maybe it came up later, in a later period in your research. Just thinking in terms of like the building of client states and US foreign relations and the racialization of Arabs and Muslims at this early moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. And yes, I definitely, in the archive, in terms of the Iranian Students Association, there were solidarity coalitions that were being formed between the Iranian Students Association as well as Palestinian student groups. So that was primarily where that connection was forged, and there were many sort of demonstrations and events that I found in the archive that sort of, you know, were co-sponsored by these two student groups. So I found that really interesting. In terms of Israel, although I didn't see necessarily in the archives during this time a sort of, I don't know, denouncement of Zionism, I definitely saw that by the mid-70s and into the 1980s coming up in the archive.
Since there are no hands, I'm going to be selfish and ask a question myself, because I'm doing a little bit of research on some Bay Area activism as well, both anti-Vietnam War activism on the one hand, as well as Palestinian solidarity activism, which also crossed in some ways, interestingly enough, with a couple of poets, Arabophone poets, with the Native American occupation of Alcatraz. And so I'm just wondering, amongst the kind of various Bay Area kind of solidarity movements and protest movements, where the ISA landed, or what kinds of connections they might have made. I mean, hinted at it, so I'd just love to hear more.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's one that I think is being studied currently. Like, not only am I interested in it, but one of my colleagues, Manija Muradian at Barnard, is currently writing, or I believe she's revising her book, so it will come out soon through Duke, hopefully, on the pre-revolutionary period and especially the Iranian Students Association. And she really talks about, you know, the importance of the Bay Area as well in her work. And even, you know, when I was speaking with Parviz Shokat, he was talking about how, you know, he and the as a part of the ISA and the Black Panther Party had reading circles, for example. So they were all really, in the ISA in particular, was really involved in other student groups who were trying to agitate for change. You know, I found even documents that were espousing or supporting the Irish independence movement at the time, you know, because they were under the colonialist sort of framework within the UK, right? So it's all, they really sort of tapped into the larger anti-imperialist framework that was around, and you can even see it in the way that they did their English language publications. So for example, one publication that they did almost monthly or bi-monthly is called Resistance Magazine. And it was basically like a print newspaper, and going through it, you know, obviously there were large features on what was going on in Iran, Iranian women's rights, repression in Iran, like the social conditions there at the time. But there was also news from Africa, news from Latin America, news from, you know, Asia. And so they really cared about the other fights or struggles going on during this time in multiple parts of the world.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for a question or two more. I'm scanning for hands raised.
Oh yeah, someone in the chat also
There you go.
mentioned.
Two more. So if I'll call on Jesus first, Jesus Munoz. And I'm gonna look for you. Hold on.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rebecca. I appreciate it. I get the impression that there were a lot of non-English publications, I guess, created by the ISA, because you keep making reference to English publications, but I'm wondering what other languages they might have published materials in, and did you notice any shift in rhetoric that was very noticeable, I guess, or notable between the English language publications, or did you think that they were more like attempts at direct translations, or maybe could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So the works that I mostly looked at were in English and in Farsi. Other ISA sort of hubs that or other CISNU hubs, so the larger umbrella under which the ISA was housed, their main sort of center was in West Germany, and then they had other branches in Paris, in Vienna. So it was like a very organized international network. And in terms of the publications in English versus the ones in Farsi, I definitely did see a difference, you know, even in terms of the way in which people were addressed. So, for example, in like the English language archive, there wasn't really a salutation in a lot of the letters, as opposed to with the Farsi language, they would say hamvatan, which I guess means like compatriot. That's loosely how I translate it. And so like even that salutation is sort of like it has a different sort of affect that comes with it. But then even in terms of the actual content, the English language is definitely much more didactic or pedagogical. It seems like this is what's happening in Iran. Here are the bullet points. Here is how it deals with imperialism. This is how we are just like you. Please help us. As opposed to the Farsi language one, which is like, this new thing happened. We need to do something. Let's get it going. Let's stop the taqutis. Or that's later in the, or I'm sorry, like that's later on. But it's very much like, we are organizing. We need to figure out how to do this, that, and the other. Please, despite your political backings, like please help us, as opposed to, the English language really appealing to the leftists, I guess.
Thank you so much. We have two chat questions coming up. One from Mariam Kashani and afterwards from Mustafa Baladi. So I'm gonna unmute Mariam right now. There you go.
Hi everybody, thank you. I'm very grateful that this conversation was open. I'm actually at Urbana-Champaign. So Ida, thank you for your talk, and thank you Northwestern. I was curious if you have in your research come across how the ISA may have been under surveillance, and if any issues of infiltration, because we know this was happening amongst other leftist and radical groups in the Bay Area at the time. So I'm just wondering if you've come across anything along those lines.
Thank you. I don't believe I've paid enough attention to the question of whether it was internally surveilled or not. In conversations with Parviz, he hasn't mentioned much of it. It seems that I should that is something that I look forward to, going back into the archive and learning more about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. And now we'll go to Mustafa. You can unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Ida, for the very useful discussion. My question is this, that based on your research, when did the support of U.S. government for the Shah, first of all, did it change after that? And when did it change and why did it change?
So are you asking about whether or not the U.S. Government supported the Shah after this particular incident?
Not necessarily right after, but basically since 70 up to 79. Obviously, there's lots of analysis here done. My question is whether during that period you think the support of U.S. government for the Shah changed, and why did it change, and when did it change?
Oh, okay, yeah. So that's a really interesting question, and something that, yeah, I think definitely, is complex in the factors that go into it. But I think that from my research, it seems that the Shah was instated right after the 53 coup in order to sort of be a beacon of sort of, I guess, hope in terms of that Iran would modernize in the U.S. image, and that it would ward off against communism in the area, because as like Ali Ansari has talked about, Iran was sort of seen as the linchpin in the Middle East at this time. So during the revolution, I wouldn't say necessarily that support, like US support for the Shah, you know, changed. I mean, even when he had cancer, he was transported, I believe, like to New York, right, for treatment. So I don't necessarily think that their relationship to not necessarily him, but sort of what he stood for and what he symbolized in terms of like the diplomatic relationship between US and Iran changed. But I do think that, you know, his image sort of waned for the United States in terms of, you know, what they were able to sort of hold with in terms of their own colonialist relationship with Iran with his fall.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Ida, again for this really fantastic talk and this wonderful discussion that you've given us. I want to welcome everyone who zoomed in from other institutions to Northwestern, and to urge you to get in touch with us, stay abreast of our events. You can email Mena, M-E-N-A, at northwestern.edu to get on our mailing list, and we hope to see all of you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.